All right, welcome to Bible study. Travis, take it away.
Thanks for everybody for joining. Tonight we are going to be doing part 4 of 5 of this study. And last time we left off, it was about the year 600. We were already seeing prophets like Amos, Micah, Hosea, and Isaiah of Jerusalem had appeared. And just to refresh, remember Isaiah of Jerusalem is the one who is recognized as the one who wrote Isaiah chapters 1 through 39. He will be writing during the Assyrian period. By 605, the Battle of Carchemish has taken place, Nineveh has fallen, and Assyria has been destroyed. So we get to about the year 600, and in that time frame, over in Athens, a lawgiver named Draco had been there. His laws, it was really the first constitutional law that we see. Certainly, there will be other constitutions that will appear in the next hundreds of years, but Draco winds up creating the first constitution. It's rather harsh. In fact, in these days, we will hear judgments or laws referred to as draconian. It's referring to him. Now, Draco meant, dragon. And so we tend to sometimes think of these as being laws that a dragon would enact. But in fact, it was this Athenian lawgiver. He dies about the year 600. It's the first, like I said, constitutional law, harsh, but absolutely universally applied. It was a law that was applied to the wealthy and the poor. Now, of course, as in all systems, the wealthy had greater access to, the judicial system. But still, this was certainly a step in the right direction. Draco's laws will be overturned later, or I should say amended, in a more equitable form. Now, at the same time, about the year 600, if we could look at image 1, Pastor, over the Olmecs in what we call Mesoamerica is creating these stone heads that were really pretty fascinating. We think of the Olmecs with the pyramids, but the Olmecs were also creating these heads, disembodied, just these heads that were found in different places. And the earliest of them, it was suspected to be around 1100 BC, but around 600, the time of our starting point tonight, is it seems to be the high water mark for these. What did they represent? Were they nature gods? We don't know. Were they supposed to be wards against intruders? We don't know. But these wind up being kind of a remarkable architectural style, or I should say sculpture style, that really lasted for about 800 years of their great proclivity. Anyway, after the, sorry, I lost my place. The Olmecs were, and that's about 600. We get now to the year 598, and we have a new king in Judah. King Jehoiakim, not Jehoiakim, that's another guy. Jehoiakim succeeds Jehoiakim as the king of Judah. What had happened? Well, remember when King Josiah goes off to fight the battle at Megiddo and fights against Pharaoh Necho, that Necho comes back and places Jehoiakim as the kind of the puppet king who was going to be paying tribute to Egypt. So now the Babylonians are starting to come to town, and there is a new king in place, Jehoiakim, and he only gets really about 10 months of of any kind of enjoyable rule, because on the 16th of March in 597 BC, the Babylonians have invaded and they have captured Jerusalem. And so poor Jehoiakim Jehoiakim is now tossed out by Nebuchadnezzar, and Nebuchadnezzar puts in Zedekiah as the next king, and Judah now becomes a puppet state of Babylon. For the last several hundred years, the kingdom of Judah and the north kingdom of Israel has been under the control of somebody, especially Israel. First, there were the Assyrians, then there was wound up being the Arameans. There were so many others. And now Judah even is starting to suffer that same kind of fate. First by the Assyrians, then by the Egyptians, and now by the Babylonians. And of that same year, on September 17th, 597, Ezekiel begins his prophecy during this first Babylonian deportation. We think about the Babylonian exile, and there was actually two stages of it. The first stage happens when Jerusalem is captured for the first time, and Nebuchadnezzar winds up taking a lot of the nobles back to Babylon to serve there. And Ezekiel starts prophesying during this time. 2 years later, 595, Psammetichus II becomes the new king when that Pharaoh Necho, the one who had defeated and killed Josiah, finally dies. Psammetichus II becomes the next king, and over in Greece, we were just talking about the death of Draco, Solon becomes the Archon of Athens, and he begins instituting real democratic reforms. I mean, real reforms. Not like the Romans are going to have, and not like we're going to have, where it's a republic. And a republic, of course, is where we choose our representatives, and our representatives makes the decisions. In a true democracy, like in Athens, the citizens make the decisions. In councils of the Council of 10,000, all that, they wind up having a direct voice in the choosing of leaders, and especially, here's the phrase, Archon, who is kind of like the great, I'm not going to say lawgiver, but at least the great statesman of Athens. So it's Solon in 594 who really begins these new democratic reforms. 4 years later, 590 BC, the Egyptian army sacks the city of Napata, which was the kingdom of Cush, today Ethiopia. And so the Cushite court now had to move to a more secure location down in what's called Meroe, which is, in Egypt, along the Nile, they list the cataracts. And so this one is known as the sixth cataract on the Nile, which is in present-day Ethiopia. So the Egyptians have now pushed Ethiopia, Cush, farther south, and kind of taken them almost out of Levantine politics. Levantine meaning like Canaan. Now, in 589, Apries takes over from Psammetichus. He only gets to be there for just a few years, and he's out. And if we'll look at image number 2, Pastor, here's our guy Nebuchadnezzar, and it's on a coin that was actually found, which of course does not have any kind of date like 589 BC, even though that was a trick my old high school history teacher tried to pass on us one time by showing us a coin of Caesar that was 45 BC. It was like, how do you know this is a fake? Okay, so here he is. This is what the coin makers, the mentors of Babylon, showed Nebuchadnezzar as looking like. You can see still the cuneiform writing there on that coin. So in 588, Nebuchadnezzar is got Israel as kind of a puppet state, and King Zedekiah decides to revolt. Jeremiah says, for crying out loud, do not revolt against this guy. This is the guy known as the destroyer of cities. Do not revolt against him. And you can read in Jeremiah, and the prophets all say, oh no, God is with us. And then they start saying things like, oh, we have the temple. And because we have the temple, God will not allow Jerusalem to be destroyed. Yeah, that argument never works. It didn't help against the Romans. It didn't help against the Macedonians. It certainly did not help against Nebuchadnezzar. It's just funny, isn't it? How, I don't mean to stop and pause here for a while, but it's just funny to me at the idea of sanctuary being either political or whatever that we still have about the church or about the building of the church, even so that people in this climate during this time of what's going on with the pandemic, oh, we can still go to church, we're safe there. Well, the folks in Lisbon in 1531 thought that during the earthquake, the safest place to be would be go into the church. God will protect us there. And the highest casualties in the Lisbon earthquake was in the churches, because of course the cathedrals were collapsing all over the people. And, you know, the church is there for a meeting, but I think about C.S. Lewis in the Screwtape Letters, when he's talking about this devil named Screwtape is instructing a young tempter named Wormwood, and he says, here's what you've got to do with the guy you're tempting. He calls him the patient. Here's what you have to do. You have to convince him that the church is simply the building with 4 walls that he meets in on Sunday morning. Do not let him see the church as we see it, which is more terrible than an army with banners spanning all space and time. Well, so the folks here think that that the temple is going to save them. So Jeremiah delivers what comes to be called the temple sermon, and he says, not going to save you. It's just not. You revolt against Nebuchadnezzar, and there's going to be a price to be paid. Sure enough, they start in with this revolt under the instigation of the Egyptians, of course, but Nebuchadnezzar then begins the siege of Jerusalem. That's in the year 588, 587. Not exactly sure if it had crossed over to 587 yet. So the siege lasts for many months, and Jerusalem then falls to the Babylonians, thus ending the kingdom of Judah. Kingdom of Israel had fallen to the Assyrians, and now the kingdom of Judah is no more. And this is when the second deportation takes place, the big one, and this is the actual official start of what we call the Babylonian captivity of the Jews. In fact, during this time now, Jeremiah is actually told, Nebuchadnezzar knows that you were prophesying not to revolt, so you're not going to get taken away. But poor Jeremiah winds up being grabbed by these refugees who are going to escape down into Egypt, and they force Jeremiah to go with them into Egypt. And so Jeremiah dies in exile in Egypt. But now over in Jerusalem, the Babylonians have taken away not just the nobility that they have taken in the first place, but they've taken away the artisans, they've taken away basically the I don't mean to put it in phrases like this, but kind of like all those who contributed to the life and development of the kingdom of Judah have all been taken away. What's left is farmers. That's nothing bad about farmers. It's simply that they were left to plow their fields there. And even one of the prophets talks about the sheep running through the streets of Jerusalem. The walls had been destroyed. The gates had been pulled down. The temple was destroyed. And Jerusalem is almost a ghost town where even sheep are running through the streets. Now, same time, 586, over in China, it's still the Chow dynasty. We've been talking about them from almost the beginning. And King Ding of the Chow, really his name, is finally dies in 586. And in the next year, on the 28th of May, is a solar eclipse that had been predicted by the Greek philosopher scientist named Thales. So this is kind of the first one that has been predicted and occurs right on time. And this is all happening while what's his name? Alyattes was fighting against Cyaxares in Media, and it leads to a truce because the two of them, each one of them thinks that this eclipse is some kind of a bad sign against them. So neither one really wants to continue the fight. So it led to a truce between them, and each one thought that they had gotten the better deal over the other one. So that's always a funny thing to me. In 585 BC, Astyages will succeed Cyaxares as the king of the Medes. Astyages was one of the worst kings ever. And the Medes now are beginning to try to expand their influence. They're not really happy about being under the Babylonian yoke. And so Astyages will be one that he is convinced that he can overthrow them. Obadiah is at this time prophesying against Edom and the Medes for exploiting the fall of Jerusalem, because here Edom had begun to kind of grab up some land and kind of grab up resources and stuff, and so Obadiah is prophesying against them because they have exploited the tragedy of the fall of Jerusalem. The very next year, now we're only talking about a couple of years after, King Jian of the Chow becomes the next king of the Chow dynasty. This same time, the Babylonians begin a siege against the city of Tyre. Remember, Tyre is one of those three principal cities of Phoenicia, Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre. And Tyre has held out for a long time. Part of the reason is because the city of Tyre can't be really surrounded because there is they're up against the coast. And so anytime things get too bad, they will actually like retreat out into ships. And of course the Babylonians don't have anything of a navy. And so they can't really surround it, and the people can still get fed because they can send ships up to other ports, get food, bring it back. And so Tyre can hold out for a long time. The city of Tyre much later will also resist Alexander the Great for a long time. And the thing with Alexander is surrender and everything will be fine. I'll treat you with respect and kindness and let you basically rule your own kingdom, but don't resist. When Tyre resists, it's a pretty ugly scene. But the Babylonians now begin a siege of Tyre that is going to last for 13 long years. So the Babylonians will be preoccupied with Tyre for quite some time. Farther to the east of them then is going to be other kingdoms that are starting to rise up because the Babylonians are so occupied over to the west. In 582, at Delphi in Greece, they begin the Pythian Games, which is kind of like the Olympic Games, but just they were more in dedication towards, who is that? Apollo, that's right. Now, in 580, the king of Persia, it's not really called Persia at the time, it's called Anshan, but the king of Persia, Cyrus I, passes away, and Cambyses I establishes the new kingdom there. And he becomes head of a new dynasty that's called the Achaemenid dynasty. That's the dynasty that's going to rule for hundreds of years in Persia there. Now, 2 years after the Pythian Games were started in Delphi, the Isthmian Games at Corinth were started. it shows kind of a culture in Greece that a lot of their so-called worship, well, I mean, I don't mean so-called, what they thought was worship, is dedicated around physical prowess, and so you have the Olympic Games, you have the Pythian Games, you have the Isthmian Games, and there'll be some more. And so they're trying to say that, you know, the greatest in human athletic achievement is the best way to honor the gods. Which is why also they only had the laurels, is because they didn't want any kind of permanent crown, no permanent trophy. It was a thing that just simply said you were the winner, and it's going to, you know, shrivel up and fade away before too long. Kind of saying that, you know, glory is fleeting. Very instructive. Now, in the 570s, we start seeing over in Rome in 579, Servius Tullius becomes the next king of Rome. The previous king had been a guy named Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, and Lucius Tarquinius Priscus was a king who was basically a tyrant, and he had been assassinated. And now Servius Tullius will take over. It's not, Rome is only going to have 7 kings, and then they're going to be pretty sick of the whole thing and decide that, okay, we need, we're not necessarily going to go the way of Athens, but we need something a little bit better than this. So in the 570s, we see the Nemean Games started, another Greek game. We see the death of King John that we just talked about, of the Chow dynasty, and King Ling. Man, you just got to love these. There's King Ping, King Ding, King Ling, and actually remember that we had a King Kong back in the very beginnings. So King Ling now becomes the next king of the Chow, and Amasis II becomes the new king of Egypt, all in this same decade. Also, born during this time is a guy named Pythagoras. If you ever took a high school math class, you remember the Pythagorean theorem and all that business comes from him. The Pythagoreans will also kind of develop into a philosophical sect. And they will start using like mathematical principles as the basis of their philosophies. Obviously, it was pretty logical, some of it. Got a little crazy in the end. But finally, in 570, it's the end of the Babylonian siege against the city of Tyre, and it's a partial victory for the Babylonians. The longest siege in the history of that city, and this is when 2nd Isaiah starts to preach. Remember, 2nd Isaiah represents Isaiah chapters 40 through 59, and this is during the time when they are in Babylonian captivity, and when we read the 2nd Isaiah, we start to see him talking about, look, you're in a foreign land, you're in a place where your destiny is not your own. You know, your future is pretty much in the hands of other people. So here's what you do: you begin doing the best you can, working the best you can, accept your situation, and pray for the success of the kingdom over you. That's how you'll have success, is if you're, he doesn't say oppressors, but that's pretty much what we're talking about. If your oppressors are successful, you'll have some measure of success. But it's also during this time that we'll see Psalms being written. Psalms like, by the rivers of Babylon, we sat down and we wept when we remembered Zion. And how can we rejoice when Zion is so far away? And so we hang our harps on the willow trees, and all of those psalms wind up coming from the time of the Babylonian captivity. In fact, I dare say that the largest majority of the psalms all come from this time period, the time of the captivity and just after. Down in the 560s, down in Cush, Amtalka succeeds his brother Aspelta as the king of the Cush, and they began wanting to move back north into Egypt. They're not going to have a whole lot of success. In 562, Amel-Marduk succeeds Nebuchadnezzar as the king of Babylon. So Nebuchadnezzar has finally passed away, and Amel-Marduk will succeed him. He will get to last 2 years, and he will be replaced by Neriglissar. Neriglissar will become the next king, and then he will wind up having a really odd time. When we read in the book of Daniel about Nebuchadnezzar, remember when it says that he went away for a while, that he had been gone for, what does it say, 7 years, that he had gone mad. He had the hair like a wild animal and eating the fruits and all that stuff. It's not really talking about Nebuchadnezzar. It's talking about Neriglissar, who in fact did disappear for a time period. It's he who steps away and who actually goes through some kind of an extended leave of absence, and he leaves a son as the prince regent. We'll talk about him a little bit later. So if we look at image 3, way over in Asia Minor, we see that Croesus becomes the king of Lydia. Here is Lydia, or here is Croesus. We showed a picture or a map of Lydia last time. It's along the far western coast of Turkey, and there was silver mines and gold mines and copper, all kinds of precious metals. And Croesus becomes the richest king in the world. In fact, I think I even mentioned before, we hear phrases like "as rich as Croesus." That's because this guy, thanks to having all those silver and gold mines at his disposal, becomes just filthy rich. Not a bad ruler, and it's funny that he chose to remember himself this way on a, what's this called, amphora. Yeah, this amphora like this, which was apparently pretty representative of him, but it also serves as a oh my goodness, I just lost the word, urn. That's right, like an urn that contains his ashes. So here is the best representative we have of him. We do have coins that came from him, but this one represents really one of the finest representation of Croesus. He will wind up being a great ruler, and he's so great that when Cyrus the Great comes along later and conquers Lydia, he leaves Croesus as the governor there. Just to jump ahead on this story, is one of my favorites, that Cyrus the Great was one of the noblest kings ever, and he was always in the habit of using local talent for the administration of his empire. So when he gets to Lydia, and a good story about the battle is that Lydia was known for its horse cavalry, and they were fast, and they were, well, the Persian army, yeah, they had horses, but Cyrus knew they weren't really going to be a match. So one thing he did know is that horses hate camels. So instead of having a horse cavalry, he had a camel cavalry, that when the camels would charge at the horses would freak out, throw the riders, and run away. So the vaunted cavalry of the Lydians was no match against the stinky, spitting camels of Cyrus. So when Cyrus is closing in, Croesus is not going to give Cyrus the benefit or the privilege of killing him. So Croesus builds a funeral pyre and jumps on it, and he has them light the pyre. He's going to immolate himself, be done with it, and not fall victim to Cyrus. Cyrus gets there, and the advanced troops get there in time, and they pull him from the pyre before he's ever even injured. And Cyrus says, why would you do something like that? And he goes, "'Cause I know you're going to torment me and humiliate me." No, I'm not. Well, you're going to drag me through the streets and treat me like a common criminal? No, I'm not. Well, then what are you going to do? I was going to make you governor. Oh, I can do that. So Croesus becomes one of the most proficient governors that Cyrus has, sending constantly money to him. And, you know, that's what Cyrus wanted all along, I guess, to fund his expeditions. So Croesus becomes the king of Lydia here in 561. And meanwhile, across the Aegean Sea, over in Athens, Pisistratus seizes the Acropolis. Remember that thing we saw last week, that hill in Athens, and he declares himself a tyrant. Wow. If you're going to give yourself a name, yeah. Now, here's the thing. When a Greek was declared a tyrant, it didn't mean tyrant like we think, like during the days of the American Revolution, we thought of King George III as a tyrant. No, when the Greeks are talking about tyrant, the original term meant an absolute sovereign who came to power without constitutional processes. Without any kind of constitutional right, he has simply seized power. The Romans would later have a word that would be kind of like that, which especially in the 20th century, we would say dictator. Even the Romans meant something a little bit different from that. So Pisistratus now declares himself a tyrant in Athens, seizes the Acropolis, and he's not going to enjoy a very long reign at all. 4 years, I think. Well, around this same time now, if we'll look at image 4, Pastor, in 559 BC, the city of Carthage, remember, that was a colony established by the Phoenicians. Down there at the very low part, in the purple, you see where Carthage is. That's the North African coast. And now, during this time, Carthage, it begins to seize Sicily, which is right there just off the toe of the boot of Italy, but also Sardinia and Corsica, the two red islands there to the west of Italy. Now, this map is of the Roman Republic, and the Roman Republic isn't around yet, but this at least shows you what the islands are. So the Carthaginians now have started to expand an empire not only along the North African coast, but they're now reaching towards Europe. Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica, those islands now give them a really good launching point into Italy too. And that'll all take place later. The same year, 599, over in Athens, the Athenian tyrant Pisistratus has now laid the foundation of the temple of Olympian Zeus. And it's going to be one of those fixtures that is still on the Acropolis today. Now, back over to Persia, and you see King Cambyses I of Anshan, remember the founder of the Achaemenid dynasty. He dies, and he is succeeded by his son, Cyrus II. We call him Cyrus the Great. Cyrus the Great is a game changer. I mean, he's brilliant militarily, but he's also an excellent human being. I think I mentioned last time that in Israel they have an institute called Yad Vashem, and it's basically acknowledging what they call righteous Gentiles. And the first one to be named a righteous Gentile was Cyrus II. You'll find out why in a second. So he now, Cyrus II becomes, Cyrus the Great becomes the king of Anshan, which is going to be Persia. And back over in Athens, we see that Pisistrata is exiled from Athens, chased away, finally thrown out. And the Chinese state of Jin defeats the rival state of Qin, and that's the very beginnings of another kingdom that's going to take several hundred years to develop. That king in Babylon, Neri-Glissar, is succeeded by Labashi-Marduk, and Labashi-Marduk is he's not going to have a long time either. In fact, he lasts like a year. No, it's more like 9 months, because then Nabonidus is the one who succeeds him as the king of Babylon. And you know what? I misspoke earlier. I said that it was Neri-Glissar who was the one who took the leave of absence. It wasn't. It was Nabonidus. So Nabonidus now, the next king of Babylon, and during this time, the kingdoms around him start to revolt again. Well, you've got Cyrus among the Persians who's starting to rise up. You have Astyages of the Medes who's starting to revolt. The Egyptians are looking to revolt again. And this guy, Astyages, was one of the worst human beings on the planet. There was a noble under Astyages who was serving him, who had basically displeased Astyages, and Astyages was convinced that this noble was planning a revolt. There seems to be no evidence of that. So the Astyages invites this noble for a banquet, and there's this great banquet, and there's all these delicacies, and there's the meat was usually served like in chunks, and so this stewed meat was presented to this noble. And when the feast was over, Astyages says, "So, did everyone enjoy themselves?" Oh, of course, everybody's going to say they enjoyed themselves. And he asked this noble specifically, "And what did you think of the meat?" Yeah, you see it coming. The noble said, "Oh, of course, it was a great delicacy, sire." And he goes, "You should enjoy it. That was your son." And that's when the nobles of Astyages start looking for help elsewhere. And Cyrus is the guy who's going to do it. Cyrus is the one that they're like, can you please get rid of this guy for us? They're so fearful of any kind of revolt, because clearly, look at what this guy does. But Cyrus will set his sights. Once he hears of this, he was like, no man like that deserves to sit a throne. Where do we? Oh, Astyages, yeah. And so now on image 5, no, not ready for that yet. On September 28, 551, over in China, we have the birth of another guy. His name is Kung Fu Tzu. We call him Confucius. And Confucius is one remarkable character who began teaching nobles, teaching, they were called mandarins. They were the like court officials. And he begins teaching this idea of ruling not simply by politics, but through ethics. And that will have such a far-reaching effect on the ancient Chinese courts of wanting to rule ethically. We'll talk about him a little bit more. So image 5, Pastor, is in 550 BC, Cyrus the Great finally overthrows Astyages of the Medes. Here he is. Here's our guy. And this is one of the most powerful statements from the courts of Cyrus. Success should always call for showing greater kindness, generosity, and justice. Only people lost in the darkness treat it as an occasion for greater greed. Wow. That should be emblazoned on every state and federal building, I would think. And that wasn't just empty words for Cyrus. Cyrus lived by that, which is what made him such a beloved king. Even among the people that he technically conquered, they would do anything for him because he always left the place better than what he found it. And the first thing that Cyrus does when he captures Babylon, which he will do, is he finds out about the Judeans, the Jews in captivity, and he makes a sacrifice to Yahweh. I mean, that's the first thing he does for them, is he has this great festival for them and offers this sacrifice. And he offers a prayer to Yahweh. Don't think for a second he converted to Judaism. That's not it. Rather, he recognized the sensibilities of these people and wanted to celebrate with them. So it's going to be Cyrus who is going to finally set these people free. In the meantime, however, over in Korea, the late Mumun period will begin. And then in 547, Croesus, that we talked about, is finally defeated by Cyrus at the river Halys. And Cyrus completes his conquest of Lydia, and he moves the capital to Pasargadae in Persia. We have another king, still in the 540s, another king of the Chow in China, and a new kingdom in Sri Lanka, used to be called Ceylon, off the southeastern tip of India. Prince Vijaya establishes the Sinhalese dynasty, which actually becomes one of the languages of Sri Lanka, Sinhalese. The Pisistratus, remember the tyrant of Athens who had been thrown out? Well, he's been sent to Delos, and in Delos he decides to purify the island there. So even though he's no longer a tyrant in Athens, he's acting like a tyrant every place else. In 540, the Persians then conquer the Lycian city of Xanthos, which is in southern Turkey now. And so Cyrus is expanding his empire kind of in an arc over Babylon and over the Levant, and has now secured basically resources and funds with all the silver and gold to pay for these massive armies before he starts moving south. The next year then, being done with the city of Xanthos and now having what is today Turkey under his command, 539, Babylon falls to Cyrus the Great. The one who is in control is the Prince Regent. He's called King Belshazzar in the book of Daniel, but he's really not a king. He's a Prince Regent. Still, he's ruling like a king. The city of Babylon was so fortified that, kind of like Jericho, they said you could race 2 chariots on top of the wall. Well, that's the way Babylon was. And the Euphrates River ran underneath the wall and through the city and then out the other wall, southern wall. Oh, so Cyrus has every place he's gone, he's conquered the Medes now, and from the Medes, he takes one of their commanders who was a great engineer, and they begin talking about, all right, how do we conquer Babylon? And the Babylonians are inside the city, laughing it up, drinking it up, because he's not going to be able to crack through here, not at all. And in fact, there's enough fishing that we'll be able to, even if we can't get to our crops and stuff, we'll be able to last. At least the king and his family, or the Prince Regent and his family will. So the engineer says, well, here's what we can do. We can divert the Euphrates River, and that will leave a dry riverbed under the wall. Exactly what they do. But they do it so far away that the Babylonians can't see they're doing that, because they've got screens of troops masking what they're doing, and they divert the river during the night. They come in under the walls. Book of Daniel talks about that. Belshazzar is having a feast, and yep, the Persians come in, and it is game over. Now, in the book of Daniel, the next chapter says, and Darius the Mede inherited the kingdom, being 62 years old, or something like that. It shouldn't be read that Darius was the one who captured Babylon. It's simply skipping ahead in the story because it's Cyrus who takes the city, and it was one of the most remarkable conquests of a fortified city in the ancient world, maybe the most. So anyway, Cyrus has taken Babylon, and the very next year he begins letting the Jews return from Babylonian exile. Not all of them are going to go. Some of them have been born here. Some of them have raised families here. Some of them have married Babylonian women or Babylonian husbands. Some of them have now children who are Babylonian and Jewish. So a lot of them don't want to go back. But whoever wants to go, Cyrus lets them go and makes the sacrifice that we talked about. So in 538 BC is the first return of the Jews. There will actually be a series of returns. So in the next year, in 537, another section or another group returns home, and this is officially known as the end of the Babylonian captivity. From 586 to 537, we're really talking about just about 50 years. Now, prophets had talked about 70 years. Prophets had talked about, that there was going to be this period of time, 70 years, and it wasn't 70 years. But the thing we have to remember is that when they're using numbers, they're not really talking about specific passages of time. They're talking about symbolic numbers. And for the ancient Hebrews, a number like 70 meant a distancing such that there's no return to it. So what Jeremiah had prophesied, what others had talked about, is this 70 years mean when you get to come back, it's not going to be the same. It won't be the kingdom of Judah all over again. It won't be the same thing that you enjoyed before. This is going to be a separation that is completely changing. So we shouldn't get too caught up in the fact that it didn't amount exactly to 70. That was never the point. Now, in 535, 2 years later, Joel, the prophet Joel, begins prophesying, and Joel starts talking about Yahweh's love for all human beings. They've been in Babylon, and Babylon had been the enemy. Certainly the Assyrians had been horrible enemies, and the Egyptians. And Joel starts prophesying that, you know what, Yahweh really does love everybody. Yahweh, and so it's from Joel that we get that great prophecy of the Spirit being poured out on all flesh. There are folks who want to say, well, all doesn't mean all, it means many. No, it doesn't. It means all. When Joel prophesies the Spirit being poured out on every living being, he means just that. Same time, 535, we have Heraclitus over in Greece, who is a pre-Socratic philosopher, and he begins to introduce a new word into Greek philosophy. The word is logos, and it will wind up having far-reaching effect among the writers like, of course, Plato, Philo of Alexandria, and certainly then when we get to the Gospel according to John, and 1 John, the letter. At the same time, Confucius is now beginning his political career. He writes a book called the Analects, which is, like I said, basing political principles on ethics. The Qi state in which Confucius counseled actually was growing very powerful under and respected under the guidance of Confucius. And it brought about the jealousy of other states too. And Confucius will find himself exiled, but it won't shut him up. In 534, the next year, over in Rome, we have a man named Lucius Tarquinius Superbus. Superbus. It means proud. In history, he is called Tarquin the Proud. He becomes the king of Rome, and he is a tyrant in the sense that we think of tyrants, not like what the Greeks were thinking. He's going to wind up being pitched out too pretty quick too, and things will definitely change after him. He is he's Superbus. He is a proud man. It's not. Don't think of proud in the sense of aggressive or some other word that, you know, some other description the word might mean. Nope, he is arrogant. I don't know if he gave himself the name Superbus or if somebody else did, but still. So in the same year, we have a city festival taking place in Athens where they began having competitions for tragedies. That is to say, dramatic tragedies. And when the Greeks describe tragedy and comedy, it doesn't mean something sad and something funny. It means the movement. A tragedy ends with a downward movement, like the failure of a hero. A comedy ends with an upward movement. Now, there wound up being some playwrights like Euripides who could write some pretty funny things in his comedies. But even then, sometimes the funny stuff occurs in his tragedies, not always in the comedies. So anyway, it's called the City Dionysia Festival in Athens, and we start seeing great notoriety being given to the playwrights, especially the writers of drama or tragedy in this time. Again, that winds up being an act of worship too, that it's not just now physical greatness that is considered worship, it's also creative intellectual genius that is celebrated. Sadly, in 530, Cyrus the Great, having taken everything that the Babylonians had ever had, and even more than that, had gone into, like we said, Lydia. He's off fighting against, it would be in what we would call Afghanistan today, fighting against a group known as the Bactrians. And sadly, he is struck by a poisoned arrow, and they can't get him back to doctors in time. And Cyrus dies. He was not that old, and he did not train his son especially well. Well, actually, I think he always hoped his son, who was an idiot, would never become the next king. But sure enough, Cambyses II will succeed Cyrus as the king. Cambyses is a egomaniacal. He is. Think about when Solomon passes away and his son Rehoboam becomes king. The first thing Rehoboam says is, I'm going to show that I have more power in my little finger than my father Solomon had in his whole body. And he winds up not listening to the old advisors of Solomon. He rather brings in his young cronies, and everything, goes to where we know it goes. Cambyses does the same thing. He is a wretched king, and he will go down into Egypt where Cyrus never went. And Cyrus probably had his sights set on Egypt, but of course the poison arrow had different aims. Cambyses will take Egypt, no doubt about it. Now, in 528 BC, a guy named Siddhartha Gautama is born in northern India, or has been born. It's in this year, however, 528, where he becomes the Buddha. He was raised as a prince. He was a prince. He was raised in the kingdom, and he never saw anybody especially old, never saw anybody especially sick. He was sheltered from everything. And one day he decides to go out for a ride in his father's kingdom, and he sees a sick man, and he's never seen anybody sick before, and he doesn't understand. Why are you sick? Um, he sees an elderly man. He sees a dead body on the side of the road, and all these things absolutely rattle everything he knew about the world. He thought the world was a beautiful place, a paradise. That's all he had been allowed to see. So he decides then, life is suffering. He thought there had been no suffering, but he goes out and he tries to study with a yoga master. It doesn't give him what he's looking for. He studies with a Hindu master, doesn't give him what he's looking for. And so finally, one day he sits down under this tree, the Bodhi tree, and he vows that he's not going to move until he has understanding. And he's there for 3 days, I think. And the story goes that the tempter named Mara came and showed to him the kingdoms of the world. See if this story sounds familiar. And you can have all of this. Nope. You can have, and then he presents these temptations as his daughters, Mara, the daughters of Mara. He shows you can have, anything you want. He shows all these great temptations. And, when we think about the temptations of Jesus, it's been called the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, and the pride of life. Well, that's pretty much the story that's told about Gautama too, the Buddha. And he renounces all of that stuff. And that's when he comes to the idea or the understanding about life being suffering and what causes suffering and how do we escape suffering. And he proposes the middle way. Now, if there was anything that everybody in the world should take some counsel from, is the whole idea of a middle way. That extremities, either side, extreme, conservative, extreme liberalism, extreme anything is not the way. It's somewhere in the middle of everything. And that was Buddha's great contribution. And he then founds what comes to be known as Buddhism. It becomes one of the 5 major world religions. All this back about the same time that we have 2nd Isaiah, same time as we have Draco, we have all these things. And in history refers to this period, the 500s, as being the axial age, where so many great leaps forward in ethics, think about Confucius, in religion, think about 2nd Isaiah, think about the Buddha, all of these great moves in law, in politics, has taken a huge leap forward during this time period. Well, over in Egypt, around the same time, Psammetichus III succeeds Amasis II as the king of Egypt. And yeah, he only gets to enjoy that for just a few months, because then Cambyses will come and conquer Egypt, defeating Psammetichus III. And this is considered the end of the 26th dynasty in Egypt. It's the start of the 27th dynasty. Now, if we'll look at image number 6, Pastor, in 522, with Persian Empire having conquered all of this that you see there, you see where it starts in Persia, that Tannish period, then taking over the kingdom of Media, then taking Lydia, then he'll actually leave Cilicia as an independent kingdom, taking over the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and then Cambyses will take over Egypt. It will be completely done by 525. Now, the funny thing is, here's the thing I love about prophecies, is that Cambyses had gone to a prophet. We don't know who. We don't know his name, but he asks, "Hey, when when am I going to die, or where am I going to die?" And the prophet tells him, "Oh, sire, you will die in Ecbatana." Now, if you'll look straight north from the Persian Gulf, you'll see the city of Susa, and then north from there is Ecbatana. Ecbatana had become kind of a cultural capital for the Persians, um, and that was where Cambyses moved his throne. Well, Cambyses says, "That's great. I'm going to die in Ecbatana. That means I'll die as an old man. I can go off on these conquests any place I want to go and never worry, because I'm going to die as an old man in Ecbatana, in my capital." So he's in Egypt, and he hears about a revolt that was taking place, and or was being, what should I say, conspired. So he decides to jump on his horse and lead his troops back to Babylon. Problem is, he's in Egypt, the climate there is different, and leather scabbards for swords, the leather scabbard had gotten so dehydrated and so crackly, that the sword, when he jumps onto the horse, sword splits through the sheath and digs into his thigh and cuts the femoral artery. Well, you know what that means. It means you're a dead man. He's taken off his horse, and a guy comes around, and one of the Egyptians is holding the horse, and so he's like, "I can't believe it." And they're like, "Sire, we can't stop the bleeding." And so he tells the old guy holding the horse, he says, "Quick, what's the name of this place?" And he goes, "Well, sire, we loved your father so much that we decided to name this after his capital. Welcome to Ecbatana." That's one of my favorite stories. So Cyrus, or Cambyses, is a goner finally, and he is succeeded by Smerdis, a good name, and Smerdis is not going to last very long at all, really. There will be another. Well, in fact, he'll last like a year. During that time, Babylon then revolts against the Persians, hearing that Cambyses is dead, and they're figuring, "Hey, this is our opportunity. We can finally get our own independence again." But and it's not going to happen, because Smerdis dies, and one of Cyrus's great generals named Darius the First, will succeed Smerdis as the ruler of Persia. Darius is one excellent general, and so he is going to start looking beyond the borders of the Persian Empire, looking for other places to go, and he will have some success. In 521, the very same year that Darius succeeds, it will be a second return of the Jews, that Zerubbabel will want to return back to Jerusalem, and Darius, following Cyrus's lead, allows him to go back home. Pretty cool. Did you clang that gong at some point?
I did about 10 minutes ago.
I suddenly caught a glimpse of a. Oh, well, we're getting to a pretty good place. Okay, so Darius becomes the next king. The Babylonian revolt has been put down. King Tao of the Chow has become that. I mean, the history of China should be rapped. I mean, rappers should get a hold of that. They could really have a good time with all the rhymes there. Anyway, Tao of the Chow becomes the next dynastic ruler, but he dies before the end of that year. In the same year, though, having nothing to do with King Tao, Haggai and Zechariah begin their prophetic career. So now we're still in the time of the Jews returning back to Israel, back to Jerusalem, and now Haggai and Zechariah begin their prophecies. There is that same year a new king in Sparta, and there starts to be Sparta, remember, and Athens are two sides of Greece, and they begin showing some hostility towards each other. In India in 516, King Darius has moved over into India, and the region known as the Punjab, which is in the far north, winds up being occupied by Darius the First. So they've moved that far, even beyond where Cyrus left off, because remember, Cyrus was pretty much left off in Afghanistan. Now Darius has moved into India. And on the 12th of March in 515 BC, Zerubbabel begins construction, completes construction on the second temple in Jerusalem. Remember, the first temple, the Temple of Solomon, had been destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. Now, under the Zerubbabel, the second temple is established. In 514, the great city of Heilu, it is now known as Wuxi in China, was established as the capital of the Wu kingdom. And Darius the Great, as he comes to be called, subdues parts of what we would call Macedonia today, Thrace, and subdues a tribe known as the Gettai, and in this war against the Scythians. Now, the Scythians, remember, are those from the plains of Russia. They were horsemen. They were constantly plaguing Darius's northern borders, and we suspect that these Scythians are none other than the Hyksos that had invaded Egypt way back in the day. So, pardon me. Darius has now moved across into Europe. Thrace is going to be part of Europe, and while there, he winds up conquering the Macedonian kingdom, and the king there, Amyntas the First, will become a vassal to the Achaemenid Empire, to the Persian Empire, and the Macedonians will absolutely chafe under Persian rule. They are not going to like it at all, and it will be because of that you will see somebody like Alexander the Great of Macedonia rise up against the Persians and invade the Persian Empire. But that's not for another 180 years. Down in Athens, the son of Pisistratus, a guy named Hippias, was expelled by a popular revolt, and thrown out of the kingdom. And they, as we told you about, and we'll talk about in another, I'll probably say that for next time. We'll see the ostracon, the stone that they wrote on. We actually have some of those, and you can see some of the names on there. Anyway, we'll talk about them later. In 510, finally, Tarquin the Proud, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, is the last of the traditional seven kings of Rome, and he will finally be overthrown. And in 510 BC is the beginnings of the Roman Republic. In the beginning, the Republic is really just made up of the nobles. Remember, in Rome at that time, there was two classes. There was the plebeians, who were the commoners, and there were the patricians, who were the aristocrats. The patricians were the ones who were in control of government. So the people would elect their senators, and the Senate would then rule Rome. If you remember, I should have gotten you one. If you remember the symbol, if you watch like in old Roman movies and stuff like that, you'll see that SPQR that's supposed to represent Rome. Well, that means Senatus Populoque Romae. Yeah. which means the Senate and people of Rome. That was the sign of authority right there. So in the 500s then, and we'll wrap it up here pretty quick. Let's see, we're not exactly sure now that I think about it, but in the first decade of the 500s, the 500 to 510, over in China, a guy named Lao Tzu writes a book called the Tao Te Ching. If we look at image 8, Pastor, and the Tao Te Ching is the foundation of the Chinese religion of Taoism.
Before we go there, you had a picture of the temple.
Oh, I blew right past that. Yeah, there is the second temple built under Zerubbabel. Obviously, that's not a photograph. That is an artist's reconstruction of it. Yeah, pretty impressive stuff. How did it compare to Solomon's temple? Not sure. We don't really have anything to, to make a good guess at what that looked like. But with the Persians being the excellent record keepers that they were, we were able to find out pretty much exactly what the second temple looked like. So yeah. Then in image 8, the next one is this is the Tao Te Ching that was written by Lao Tzu, and he actually wrote it on silk. That is silk, not parchment even. It's just a silk scroll. Kind of cool. Taoism will become again one of the major religions of China. Still followed by some today, not really in China. It's mostly like college campuses that want to follow it. The Tao was supposed to be simply a universal principle or a universal truth, and we all come from the Tao and we all return to the Tao. Anyway, interesting stuff. On September 13th, 509, the Temple of Jupiter on Rome's Capitoline Hill was dedicated, and that becomes one of the great temples of ancient Rome. And at the same time, or actually the next year, the Romans create the office of Pontifex Maximus, the high priest. That becomes a political office more than a religious office. The next year, Cleisthenes, a Greek reformer, takes power in Athens, and he begins the expansion of real democratic reforms. I mean, democracy, like we talked about, not just the wealthy who are having a say now, but all people. That all begins under him. Then in 505, Rome will begin electing executive officers, and they're called consuls. And the Romans were smart enough that they did not elect just one consul. That always leads to corruption. They elect 2 consuls. And so these consuls will actually share power for, the term of office, which is usually like a year at that point. So the first pair was elected by the Senate in 505. And then Rome will use these consuls as commanders of their military. And so now with kind of a unified, centralized command system, the Latin League, as it's called, which has Rome at its head, will finally defeat the Etruscans. The Etruscans had been a major power. We talked about them last time. And now the Latins, the Romans especially, have started putting them under heel. Cleisthenes will, in 501, finally make a vote available to all citizens in the democracy of Athens. And the same year, the Romans, because of the threat of a group known as the Sabines, they will appoint for a 6-month term a dictator. Not in the sense of Mussolini or Hitler or others I could name. Not in that kind of sense. A dictator was one who had complete military authority for 6 months or as long as a crisis should exist. And then what happens? At the end of those 6 months, they go back to being a farmer. They go back to the office that they had. They go back to whatever they were doing before. Once the crisis is over, think about the judges of Israel. That a judge wasn't an official position. It wasn't a paid governmental office. Rather, it was when the time was necessary, when the Philistines or the whoever was doing whatever, a judge would come, deal with the problem, and then kind of go back home to tend the sheep. That's basically what the dictators are doing too. So dictator only in the sense of complete military control for the duration of the crisis. So Rome has now will use that very often as things move along. And in 501, same time, Confucius is now appointed as the governor of Chengdu, but he will wind up being exiled and will spend the rest of his life teaching. And that's where his great influence really starts taking place. Is the Analects has been published, and he begins taking students. And at any one time, they said he had, some say 70, others say 72, doesn't matter, that many students at one time that he would teach in not just politics, ethics. That's where he spent most of his time teaching. Pretty impressive. Carthage, in the same year, an eventful couple of years, Carthage will wind up taking the city of what we call today Cadiz in Spain. It was called Gadir at the time. And so the Carthaginian, it's becoming an empire, has now not only taken Sicily and Sardinia and Corsica and a large part of North Africa, now they've moved over into Europe itself, into Spain. Darius, then in the year 500, proclaims that the official language of the western half of the Persian Empire, the whole western half of the empire, that Aramaic becomes the official language. That's pretty huge. That's why that for hundreds of years, if you knew Aramaic, you could travel from Egypt all the way up until Macedonia. And it becomes what later Latin would become, or Arabic would later become. It becomes just a principal language. Pretty impressive. So in that same year, 500, in India, the first republic of the Vaishali Bihar is established. So you're seeing democracies and republics starting to appear from not only Greece and Rome, but as far over as India as well. Yeah, it's a remarkable phenomenon to watch. But also in 500 is the beginning of the prophetic career of Malachi. While he is kind of thought of as the last prophet, that's where his book lasts. There will be another prophet who comes after him that we'll talk about next week. And finishing off, got to finish off with linguistics. In 500 BC, a guy named Panini, don't know if they named a sandwich after him or not, but a guy named Panini, he actually, in India, writes a systematic treatise on the Sanskrit language, which actually is what made Sanskrit the preeminent language of Indian culture. But he writes these massive expositions on noun compounds, and he is known as the father of linguistics. That the whole theory and philosophy of linguistics begins with this guy, 500s BC. Pretty impressive. And that is where we'll leave off at 500. Next time, we'll talk about other things. Rome, Greece, and Alexander. And Daniel. He's the last one.
Pastor Elizabeth here with a recap of the Q&A time we had after Travis finished his teaching. And I was debating doing this recap or not, and then decided to do so because we ended up having a rich conversation on a number of topics. So I'll do my best to recap it, starting with learning that these 500s BC, a term that's used to talk about this time is the axial age. And using that term axis as a time when there's a lot of change in the way that humans looked at things in areas of ethics and religion and law. This was a time, as you heard, having listened to this, of Confucius and Buddha, second Isaiah, a lot of different things going on. So the axial age, if you're looking for a term to describe this time. And one of the questions that I brought up to Travis was when he was talking about Confucius and basing his politics on ethics and ethical teaching. I asked Travis, I was like, so basing it on your ethics as opposed to what? Because it's so ingrained in me from my faith, from how I grew up, of like, yes, my values, my ethics inform how I interact in the public sphere, in politics. And sort of chuckled for me to realize in conversation with Travis and others that the opposite of that is what we've been hearing about this whole time, right? The strive for political power, authority, land, all of that is what informed what choices you would make. So that desire for power, greed, whatever that was motivating you, informed your ethical choices, informed how your values, or how those played out. And so that leads me to think about our times today and through other times in history, and ask that question, for myself, for leaders in any capacity, local, national, international, within churches and communities. When you're seeking power for the sake of power and prestige, how are you twisting what ethical values you have, or how are those desires for power actually forming the way that you act in life, and creating some cognitive dissonance maybe with what the values that you have in your heart and in your mind, and really seeking leaders today that have that in sync, that the values, the ethics that they hold dear is what is lived out in a public sphere. And I think for Christians, our center of that in Christ, of love and compassion, humbleness, seeing strength is found in weakness and in unexpected ways and places. Having a theology of the cross is not one of glory and power, but it's of speaking up to the political powers. That's what Jesus did, and it got him killed. But then death could not hold his love and his power. And so, I'm getting a little preachy here. I'll turn back to summarizing what we then talked about. So this was a time of talking about Confucius and Buddha and clarifying that Confucianism is not a religion. And the question came up, can you be Buddhist and Christian? And that's certainly something that relates for today, right? And my experience in interfaith dialogue and learning mirrors a lot of the people I meet in those spaces, where my convictions as a Christian and bringing that to the table to learn about others' faith is an asset, and coming respectfully to listen to what another religion teaches doesn't mean that I'm not Christian if I go and learn from another religion or faith or study another holy book. And rather, I have my own Christian and Lutheran faith have been expanded and affirmed by studying other religions. And also the idea of a general revelation of God in all of creation means that I can see the holy and practices like meditation or yoga, other spiritual disciplines can help me encounter the holy and divine. And in the case of meditation or of other things that sort of focus on emptying yourself of distractions, it actually connects more to, there's a Christian mystical tradition that many Christians don't know about, but they learn about it because of connecting with Buddhism or Hinduism or practicing yoga, then invites them to look at their own tradition and learn about that a little bit more. And so the other part of all of this is to not take over someone else's identity, because not co-opt it, right? Inauthentically. And so as you are learning about other faiths or traditions, saying that you learn or are appreciating something in that context, to do so in a way that honors the depth of tradition and the many believers they may have around the world. And if you are interested in the particular Christian Buddhist conversation, there's a book written by somebody named Paul Knitter. That's Knitter. And he wrote a book that said, without Buddha, I could not be a Christian. And that his view might not be one that others agree with, but that's one resource out there for you to read a little bit more. And locally, in our context in Greenwood, Wisconsin, we have a wonderful gift of the Christine Center, which is a group of nuns who hold spiritual retreat and have a lot of resources on the mystic tradition. And so I'd encourage you to check out a monastery or another retreat space near you. It's likely that they have many resources as well for you. So that is talking about there's a general revelation of God in the world, and then it's a different thing to say there's a specific revelation in the person of Jesus Christ that gives me a particular way, and for me, the purest, I don't know if that's the right word, clearest understanding of who God is in that person of Jesus Christ. That in him, God was revealed in a particular way. That is what is true for me, and as a pastor, what I teach and share with my congregation. But I hope that that sense of general and specific and particular revelation helps you in thinking about engaging with other religions. And the last part I want to say on that is sometimes I was trying to think about the best way to phrase this. We need to know that God has room for questions and doubts and wrestlings, and God is big enough for all of that. Sometimes when we explore other religions or we get enticed by like, oh my gosh, that's so amazing. I never learned about that in my faith. Or my Christian faith or whatever it is so rigid and tight. And that's been maybe your experience of it. And there is such a width, a depth and breadth within any religious tradition that I encourage you to ask questions of what you've been taught, what you believe, what the Bible says, what you think it says, read scripture, read what it actually says and wrestle with it and take those questions into prayer and delve a little more maybe into other expressions of your Christian faith, or if you're watching this in your different religious tradition, look at different expressions of your religious tradition before dismissing all of it. Yeah. Thanks again for joining us, and we are going to have another session in 2 weeks to finish up the Old Testament, and then we're going to move to the New Testament in its historical setting. Hope you can join us. Bye.